Okay, in this in the second recording for Module 8, I will discuss the categorical imperative some more. So in this first slide and second recording, I'll talk about how it became categorical. Why is it categorical? And how does categorical differ from something hypothetical? So something categorical is something that applies unconditionally. By contrast, something hypothetical applies conditionally, right? So hypothetical imperative is an imperative that applies to someone provided certain conditions are met. So first, hypothetical imperatives are optional rules of conduct. So they apply only to certain groups of people. People can be separated or sorted into sets depending on whether they have certain desires or whether they belong to a certain group. That's how you divide the people into sets in this discussion. So here is a first example of a hypothetical imperative. So usually hypothetical imperatives have an if-then structure. So if you want to write well, then write something every day, even if you don't feel like doing it, right? To whom does this imperative apply? It only applies to people who want to write well. If you don't want to write well, it has no power over you. It has no compulsion for you, right? So the applicability of the statement depends on whether you have a certain desire or whether you have a certain goal, in this case, to be a good writer, right? So our hypothetical imperative is like that. So here, this applies to the set of people who have the desire to write well. Now, you can talk about, let me just go back. Okay, so here, the first example of hypothetical imperative, the rule applies to you if you belong to this group of people who want to write well. You can also have hypothetical imperatives that depend on group membership. If you belong to a particular student organization, you will have to follow the rules of that organization. You will have to meet the expectations, especially for new members. So that can be attending meetings, participating in activities, doing certain tasks. Post-pandemic, that can be spending time with other members of the organization, right? So those compulsions, those requirements, right? The requirement to attend General Assembly, the requirement to participate in a group activity or to promote a certain event, that kind of requirement applies to you only insofar as you belong to that org and you want to continue belonging to that org, right? Once you say, ayoko na, right? The imperative loses its force, right? It's no longer a requirement to you, right? Now, some people say all imperatives are hypothetical, right? It's just that there are certain rules we have to follow when we have a certain goal. If we want to write well, if we want to be a good researcher, be a good scientist, if you want to be professional, if you want to graduate from college, then we have to follow certain rules, or we belong to certain groups like student organizations, classes, like the ethics section that you belong to, ETHICS1 section you belong to the course, whatever you're majoring in, that's a group. There are certain requirements for you to continue to belong to that group. Membership in a university, like if you want to be a UP student, continue to be a UP student, continue to be a UPLB student, you have to follow certain requirements. And almost all things like this, we can back out of them. We can back out of being a member of a student org. We can back out of being a student of a university. We can even back out of things such as citizenship, right? I assume that most or all of you are Filipino citizens. Can you back out of that? Can you say, ayoko na. I don't want these requirements for Filipino citizens to apply to me anymore, right? Can you say that? I think you can, provided somebody else is willing to have you and some other country is willing to grant you citizenship. You can back out of being a Filipino citizen. For practical purposes, we need citizenship for the passport, if nothing else. So for practical purposes, you need that, right? Now, Kant says, not everything is hypothetical. There is something that categorically applies to us. There is a group to which we belong that we cannot back out of, right? That it's impossible, logically impossible to back out of it. We cannot back out of it even in thought experiment, right? And what is that? What is the group to which we belong that we cannot opt out of? Quick answer, being human, right? The categorical imperative is rooted in being human, right? Now, I think some of us would like to be non-humans, right? Sometimes students, well, not just students, people talk about wanting to be a potato. I suppose what they mean is couch potato, to not have responsibilities, to just like be there and like hang out and do nothing else. But we can't choose that. That's not within the realm of our choosing. We are human. We were born human. We cannot take that back. We cannot change that either backwards or forwards, right? So Kant says the categorical imperative applies to us because we're human beings. Because we're human beings, we have certain duties. That's the idea. So he says there's a set of requirements it's impossible to opt out of because it's impossible to opt out of being human. I've been explaining that. And here, the insight or the idea is that humanity is a source of moral obligation. Because I'm human, I must act in a humane way. Maybe something that we can consider, right? This humane idea, humans being required to be humane, and humane means ethical, right, is inscribed in language. And it's not just inscribed in English. Baka mas madali sa Filipino. Kasi sa Filipino may kasabihan tayo, madaling maging tao, mahirap magpakatao. Ang pagpapakatao nakaugat sa pagiging mabuti, lalo ng pagiging mabuti sa kapwa. So this moral obligation is rooted in our nature, in what we are, right? So that's what we need to explore. I'm sorry. I am messing up my slides here. So humanity is a source of moral obligation. We must act a certain way because we're human, right? We must act a certain way because we're human. Maybe the easier way to understand that is this. We must act in a certain way because other people are humans like us. We cannot treat other people like objects, like tools, like instruments for our own personal goals, because they are free like us, right? So this theory that values autonomy, values the autonomy of the agent, you, me, right? But also values the freedom of all other agents like me. Yes, I am free, but other people are free as well. So I cannot use my own freedom to deny them of theirs. So an important element of the law of freedom is how to live with other autonomous beings like myself. How do I remain free while respecting and recognizing other people's freedom? Now, the minute you ask that, of course, you see that it already has an ethical dimension. This is what ethics is all about. How do I live out my freedom in a way that, one, I'm not clumsy about it. I don't commit self-sabotage. I don't make choices that lead me to a dead end. That's for my personal benefit. Second, I use my freedom in such a way that doesn't violate the freedom of others who are free in exactly the same way as I am, right? So the laws of freedom apply to these two branches at the same time, right? So let's now talk about the motivations to do the good, so you can be a bit clearer about Kantian deontology and about this business of abiding by or following the categorical imperative. Okay, so let's talk about three kinds of motivation to do the good. So again, we are considering the idea of motivation or the reason behind an action, right? Kant's theory tells us that people do the right thing for the wrong reasons. And when people do the right thing for the wrong reasons, that's still wrong. On the Kantian view, that's still wrong, right? So for us to see what doing the right thing for the right reason looks like, let's look at three kinds of motivation to do the good. The first is being impelled to do something because of another inclination. So first motivation to do the good, another inclination. So prudence or self-interest, right? So this is the example in Kant's groundwork. He says, it certainly conforms with duty that a shopkeeper not overcharge an inexperienced customer so that a child can buy from him as well as from everyone else. So the example is about a shopkeeper. Pwede natin sabihin, tindera sa palengke, tindera sa palengke, na hindi nagsisinungaling kung magkano yung tinda niya. This is an issue because in marketplaces, in markets, there are no price tags and there are no barcodes or anything like that we have in supermarkets. So one very well-known thing that can happen in the market is for the seller, for the, let's say, fruit stall owner, to give different prices to different people. Right, so especially if the customer or the person buying looks like she does not know how much something costs. Right? Baka mukhang walang kamuang-muang ito kung magkano isang pirasong saging. So lumapit siya sa akin, nagtanong, magkano? Ang sagot ko, iba. Mas mahal. Right? So what if somebody doesn't do this? So that a child or any other inexperienced person who doesn't know how much something costs will pay the same price, right? But why does the shopkeeper do this? Is it because it's the right thing to do? Maybe not exactly. Maybe the reason is that this is good for business. It's good for business because when you're like this, the people come back and buy from you again. So it's good for business because of the the repetition of purchases by the new customer, right? Even if they're a child or somebody who's completely oblivious to the price of goods, has no baseline information on how much something costs, right? So according to Kant, this is less good. Being impelled to do the right thing because it benefits you in this way, right? Wanting to do the good because it benefits you means that you are conditionally good. This is not the best kind of motivation because it is unreliable. The minute, so here what you're really willing, what the shopkeeper is really willing is benefit to herself. That she gets a flourishing business where a lot of people come and buy things from her. That's what she is willing, and that she continues to earn a lot of money, right? But if that's no longer the case, right, she may do something completely different. And sometimes it happens in markets, in places where there are a lot of tourists, where there's no issue, or there's not a lot of issue of being a repeat purchaser, because you just go there and then you leave, and then somebody else comes and you don't come back for months and months. So here, this is not the best motivation to do the good because this is being conditionally good, right? So this is not the best. The second is being motivated by immediate inclination. Immediate inclination, especially in terms of emotion. So here, I have an example of a person who, a person who helps the needy only because they need to be needed. So this is a problematic kind of psychological tendency where you try to help someone because it makes you feel good that you're needed by that person. In this case, helping might be designed so that the person who's being helped never becomes completely independent, right? Because there's this desire to keep them dependent and needy. And also, we can help the needy only because we pity them. What if they're not pathetic? What if we don't happen to have the emotion of pity, right? See, the thing about immediate inclinations that depend on emotion is, again, they're unreliable. We cannot decide what emotions happen to us. Emotions are like that. We're almost always passive to it. So whether we're going to feel pity, whether we're going to feel fear, that depends on so many variables beyond our control. So if we are only doing the right thing, like helping the needy, because we feel pity, we are not going to help people or sentient beings that don't look pitiful. And that means our helping is probably going to be unprincipled. It's going to be driven by certain emotions that are accidentally there. We don't determine that. And also, one wonders if we're really being free, making choices, because it looks like we're just being pulled around by certain emotions that we have. Now, Kantians are not against emotions. They're not saying emotions are bad. They're saying that acting based only on emotions is problematic because it's unreliable. Acting only based on emotions means that if for whatever reason we don't have the pity or we don't have the feeling, then we don't help, we don't do the right thing, right? So this is sometimes discussed in terms of something called poverty porn, where there's a lot of really pathetic pictures or stories that are, or human interest stories based on a single individual. And there is a tendency to help that particular individual because the story tugs at your heartstrings, and you maybe you even cry when you're hearing about the story, right? And you do something that makes you feel good, actually, because you attend to your emotion, but you don't attend to the structural problems that affect so many other people and that may be affecting people you don't happen to pity or who don't happen to strike you as pathetic, right? This can happen, again, for helping with the effort to conserve or to prevent the extinction of certain animals. It's very easy to raise awareness and raise money for saving cute animals. Like if you're saving koalas or pandas, it's relatively easy to raise money for that. But if you are raising money and support for saving animals that are scaly and unattractive or even scary, even if they're at the brink of extinction, the effort is not as easy, right? And this is because people are motivated to do the good out of immediate inclination only, right? So Kant is saying this is unreliable. Unreliable. We want something more reliable than this. We want something that is deliberately chosen on principle. Okay. So the third motivation to do the good is the best. This being motivated by duty, what anyone in the same circumstances ought to do because it is right, right? So notice that For Kant, it's possible to do the exact same thing with the exact same result, but for the action to have a different moral status because the different people who did them have different intentions or motivations, right? So you can contribute to feeding the hungry, like in the example of, or saving the child from the shallow pond, like the example that we saw in Peter Singer. Is it the right thing to help someone not drown? Is it the right thing to do to feed the hungry? Yes. But what's our motivation? Is our motivation to contribute to charity to get rid of guilt? So that's something that benefits you, that benefits the person, right? Is your desire to contribute to charity there because you want to have a good reputation, in which case what matters more is the publicity, that you contribute to charity in a way that other people sees it, right? In a way that other people see it, right? Or you contribute to charity because it's the right thing to do. Only the third motivation is approved of by Immanuel Kant. That's the only motivation that aligns with duty. So let me give some more examples, and let me explain some more. So first, as we have seen in the slide where I showed you the cartoon from Calvin and Hobbes, everyone must act according to a rule that would be rational for anyone in the same circumstances to follow. So here, so in that case, it's rational for someone not to want to be hit or to be pushed. So it's rational also for you not to do the pushing or the hitting, right? So it's rational even if you change your standing in the scenario. Either you're the one being pushed or you're the one who's doing the pushing, right? So it's rational for anyone across different circumstances, right, to do, right? So not to hit, not to push. So it is something that we must do even if we don't feel like doing it. So even if we feel like pushing because we're frustrated or having a really bad day, if it's the right thing to do, not to do that, you still don't do it, right? So duty has this idea that it's based on reason, right? What you think is right, what you deliberated on, and something that you choose on the basis of principle. So another example that I'll be giving is based on the parable of the Good Samaritan. So if you recognize somebody needy, you can still help them even if you don't have like the soft, warm, fuzzy feelings that you sometimes have. Of course, if your principle and your fuzzy feelings go together, that's good, not least because it's easier to help people if we both rationally judge that they need help, and two, we have a natural sympathy for them. That's easy, right? In that case, emotion and reason come together and we can act on those two things. So remember, the problem is acting on emotion and emotion only. So we have an interesting example that, or at least an example I'm going to interpret in a certain way that illustrates Kant's point. Okay, so I'm going to use the parable of the Good Samaritan. I'm sure almost all of you are familiar with the story. I just want to say that I'm not using this necessarily under the Christian perspective. The parable of the Good Samaritan is a very interesting story that I think it's something that we can make sense of even if we're not necessarily Christians. Of course, if you're a Christian, it has a special dimension for you, but it's not necessarily being discussed here in terms of the Christian faith, right? So I'm going to interpret the story where there's this man. He's a Jew. It's important for the story that he's a Jew. He was traveling along a deserted road and he was robbed and he was beaten up and he was actually left to die at the side of the road. And a priest passes by, a Levite passes by, and they don't help him. And then the Samaritan passes by, and it's the Samaritan who helps him. Now, sometimes this is interpreted as the Good Samaritan has a good heart, had a good heart, that the Good Samaritan pitied the injured man, and that's why he helped, right? I want to discuss a specifically Kantian interpretation of the story, and I'll explain where that's coming from. You see, I think it's unlikely that the Samaritan in this story felt warmth and sympathy for the injured Jew, because Jews and Samaritans have nothing in common. They're enemies. They don't fraternize. They're not friends. They don't eat on the same table. They don't use the same cups and plates. They hate each other, right? So he's traveling, the Samaritan is traveling on a lonely road, finds an injured man, probably very dirty and bloody, which is unclean for people at that time. So he's unclean at the level of like he's literally dirty with like he's rolling in dirt, but also he's unclean because there's blood involved, and he belongs to the enemy of the Samaritan, the Jewish people. But he's at death's door. If nobody helps him, this is in the middle of the desert. He's going to die from exposure, or maybe animals will come or whatever, right? He's in danger. He needs help. The Samaritan judges that it's the right thing to do to help him, help the injured Jew, right? So I think that the parable illustrates that we must love those whom we cannot like. And love here can mean helping and taking care of that person. So what does the Samaritan do? I think it's very telling what the Samaritan does. The Samaritan brings the Jew to an inn and pays the innkeeper to take care of him and then leaves. This is not a story in which they became best friends forever and became really close. That's highly unlikely given the sociological realities of that period. But the Samaritan acted, it seems, I think, on a choice that this is the right thing. This is a man who needs help. He's at death's door. What do I want done to me when I'm in that position? I want to be helped because I want to live. So this is what I'm going to do, right? So the loving and the helping are dependent on choice, how we exercise our freedom. Right? So for those of you who are Christians, I think that it's interesting that the imperative is love your neighbor, not like your neighbor, because liking is not completely under our control, right? Loving someone or helping someone depends on what we choose. Liking someone depends on certain accidents, like are they from our hometown? Do they speak like us? Do they have certain hobbies that are like ours? Do we have some emotional sympathy for them? And then we can like them, right? Which is something accidental and largely not dependent on choice or freedom, right? So here we see the motivation to do the good is based on reasoning and the careful exercise of freedom, right? So now I will discuss the categorical imperative under the formula of universal law. The first thing is that the categorical imperative has three formulations. So Kant speaks in a math-like way. So the core, there are three formulas under the categorical imperative. What I have been talking about almost entirely is something called the formula of universal law. There are at least two other formulas, the humanity formula and the kingdom of ends formula. We will reserve those two other formulas for next week, right? So we have seen the formula of universal law before. The text that you are supposed to read, the required reading for this module is on the formula of universal law. This is really what it's all about. And you need to grasp certain fine-grained details on this formula. So you need to read that text. And also, you need to understand how you can apply this. This is what we're going to move towards in this part of the recording. So according to the formula of universal law, we must act only in accordance with the maxim which we can at the same time will to become a universal law. something that can be normalized in the world of the thought experiment, and we can conscientiously and actively will that world into existence. Now, to explain that, we have to define certain terms. Kantians don't look at consequences, they look at the motivation. So they examine what they call a maxim. A maxim is a rule of conduct. It's a statement that features two things: A, a something to do, and B, a reason for doing that action. So to examine the motivation, we must surface or formulate a possible maxim or a possible rule that the person is following. Usually, we can't access this, and we can only observe human action in ourselves and in others, and then we can begin to wait, what is this following, right? So to formulate the maxim that you can then test, you need the statement with two parts: a something to do and a reason for doing that action. Course Guard talks a bit more about this in her article on the formula of universal law. So a maxim is a subjective principle for action, right? So something like make a false promise to get money, or slap someone so that you can feel better after having a bad day. That's a maxim, right? It has something to do and the reason for doing it. And so it's a proposed course of action, and then it's something that you can now test, right? So you can determine whether it's acceptable or not. And the way that you do that is you conduct the thought experiment, the twin earth thought experiment that I've been talking about. So I've said this already, a maxim is also like a motive or a reason for doing something, the principle on the basis of which an action is chosen. Kantians believe that human action or human behavior is principled. It follows a certain maxim, right? So we don't just make, the idea is like this: we don't just make one-off choices, like what you're going to eat for dinner, or what you're going to wear. You don't just make one-off choices like that. You don't just say, okay, what am I going to eat for dinner? Am I going to have a sandwich? Am I going to eat vegetables because I want to be healthy? Am I going to eat fish because that's what's available? We can make those individual decisions, but there's if you like, a deeper principle behind our actions or behind our choices or behind the way that we organize our choices, because there are some things that are both logically and physically possible that we don't even consider. I'll give you a concrete example, and I'm sorry if you're going to be scandalized about it, but I think it illustrates the point. So if you're trying to figure out what you're going to eat for dinner, sandwich, vegetables, fish are the options. You don't start considering if you're going to eat your pet cat or your pet dog. That's not one of the choices that you consider. That means your choices are already ordered by you. There are things that you don't choose in principle. That's what it means to say human action is organized around a maxim, right? There are things that we don't choose because we think those choices are off the table, even if they are logically and physically possible, right? That's how we use our freedom. We have these principles, and sometimes, maybe even most of the time, we're not very conscious of them. But sometimes when moral dilemmas come out, we have to bring the maxims to the surface so that we can test them. And by that, we mean we do the thought experiment, and also we examine the maxim or possible maxims more closely, right? So another way of expressing this idea that we test the maxims is we test for universalizability. So that's what